Right. Good morning, everyone. Afternoon, good morning, and slash afternoon. Hello, hello. It's so great. I've been saying this quite a few times over the past few weeks that we've been doing more in-person programming. It's so great to see faces back here in the Enoch Pratt Free Library. So thank you all for joining us. Please, a round of applause for yourselves for getting out of bed and joining us this morning. Thank you. My name is John Cardellino. I am the Best and Next manager here at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. And we are thrilled to be presenting, and I confirmed this before the show, the 42nd year of A Saturday with Sherlock Holmes here at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Right? Another applause. So to kick us off, I wanted to introduce our MC and to be presenting our welcome address. So please, before I do that, we are also, in addition to the in-person event here, streaming out to online. So hello, everybody on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled to be able to be providing this hybrid programming, both to be able to have people and welcome people back in the library for these special events, and also being able to provide accessibility through our virtual platforms. So thank you everyone in-house, and thank you everyone online for joining us today. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming S. Brent Morris to get us kicked off today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brent.
Good morning, everybody. I am rather excited to be here. This was I was first introduced to organized Sherlockiana through the Enoch Pratt meeting. Now, I realize that I'm using the word organized in a very specialized sense, but those of you that have been around Sherlockians know what extent we're organized. So you'll see that. Now, one bit of business, please put your phaser zones done. If there are any interruptions, we would like it to be something really dramatic, not just a phone call. We are very pleased this year to return to the Central Library. We've been at the Orleans branch for several years as they were making renovations here. Then COVID kept us out, and now we're back to our roots, which is very nice. The eminent Sherlockian Phil Sherman started this program in 1979, and it is sponsored this year by 3 local Sherlock Holmes groups, all science societies of the National Baker Street Irregulars. The sponsors of this Saturday with Sherlock Holmes are the Six Napoleons of Baltimore, the Sherlockians of Baltimore, and Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City. Our coordinator this year is Carla Coop, past Cassagene of Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City. Now, one thing that I find a little nervous about being a master of ceremonies, and I was thinking about this as I'm preparing, it's really great if you have a joke. You know, a couple of jokes you can intersperse to break the ice. I'm not good at jokes. But I did see something on TV. I was watching Penn and Teller. I'm sure you've seen the show, Fool Us with Penn and Teller. There was a magician on there that did a great trick. And I said, that's perfect. If I could master that trick, I don't have to tell a joke. Here's what the magician did. She came out with some cards. She had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards. She threw away 1, 2, 3 of the cards, gave them a tap, and she had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards left. I said, that's a good trick. That would be perfect to break the ice at the Pratt. So I went down to the magic shop. I went up to the owner and I said, excuse me, ma'am, do you have the trick? I saw it on Penn and Teller. The magician comes out and counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards, throws away 1, 2, 3, gives the cards a tap and has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards left. And I said, that's what I'd like to buy. She looked at me and she said, do you mean the trick? It was last Thursday where the magician comes out and counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards, throws away 1, 2, 3, gives him a tap and has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards left. And I said, that's the trick I want. She got the saddest look on her face and she said, I'm sorry, I sold the last one yesterday. She was out of the trick. I couldn't buy it. And I went home and I practiced as hard as I could. The problem is every time I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards, and I throw away 1, 2, 3, and I give it a tap, I only get 1, 2, 3, 4 cards back. I never learned how to get the last 2 to come back. And that's why I can't do that today. So I will continue practicing, and perhaps next year I can learn how to do that trick. Boy, it's messy up here for some reason. Well, our theme this year is on extraordinary objects in the canon. Things that, and the canon are the writings of Dr. John Watson, is edited by Arthur Conan Doyle. And they're unusual objects, and each of our speakers is going to tell us about that. Our first speaker is going to be Alan Reddick, and his topic is Fiddling with the Gramophone, a recorded ruse in the Mazarin Stone. Alan Reddick is retired from a career in audio, video, and film production and communication management. He is the founding webmaster of the Red Circle of Washington, a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, and is invested in the Baker Street Irregulars as the Red Lamp. Alan has spoken at a number of Sherlockian events and has a new article upcoming in the Baker Street Journal. Today, he'll be illuminating us on some Sherlockian technology in his presentation, Fiddling with the Gramophone. Please welcome Alan Reddick.
Well, all right. It is so good to be back with live, or reasonably live, Sherlockians. Oh, yes, I can take it off, can I? I'm special now. I can take my mask off. That's wonderful. No, it is great. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I am glad to be here. And as you've heard, the title is Fiddling with the Gramophone, and it's a recorded ruse in the Mazarin Stone. The text for today's sermon is an admonition by Sherlock Holmes to a count and his faithful enforcer. The text is, "No violence, gentlemen, no violence, I beg of you. Consider the furniture." Well, it's found in the adventure of the Mazarin Stone, where we see that a gramophone has indeed taken its place as part of the furniture at 221B. The Mazarin Stone was published in the Strand magazine and Hearst's International magazine in the fall of 1921, 17 years after Baring Gould says it took place in the summer of 1903. And I'm sure most of you know that you won't find the Mazarin Stone on many Sherlockians' top 10 lists. In fact, on some of those lists, it ranks 60th out of 60. What makes so many people think this story is so awful? Well, for one thing, there seems to be a new blueprint for the sitting room at 221B. There's a second room, there's a second door to the bedroom, and we've added some sort of a waiting room, which we don't know anything about. It's only one of 2 stories that's written in the third person, and we do miss Watson's voice, don't we? So who did write it? Did Watson change his approach? Did the literary agent write it? Many have pointed out that it resembles Doyle's play, The Crown Diamond. Or was somebody just commissioned to knock it out? Whatever, it reads like a not very compelling pastiche. What's more, it's not much of an adventure either, because Holmes has already solved the case as the curtain goes up. Pretty thin gruel. And then there is the plagiarism. Some elements are lifted directly from The Adventure of the Empty House, including the decoy in the window, the air gun, and the fact that the marksmen in both stories have reputations as big game hunters. Okay, so what's the other side of the coin? What makes the Mazarin Stone great? Technology. What else? Holmes was a Victorian early adopter. He used the telephone liberally. He was no stranger to early motor cars. And we learn here that Baker Street sported a gramophone. Here's how it figures in the plot. Holmes finds himself alone in his sitting room with Count Negretto Silvius, and explains in detail how he knows that Silvius has stolen a valuable crown diamond. Silvius has already been amazed by the wax decoy of Holmes in the window when they're joined by Silvius's lapdog and personal goon, Sam Merton, who has been waiting outside. Holmes suggests that Silvius and Merton discuss their options, the jewel or jail. He says, "I'm going into that bedroom. I shall try over the Hoffman barcarolle upon my violin. In 5 minutes, I shall return for your final answer." He goes into the bedroom, plays the barcarolle not on his violin, but on his gramophone, then slips through the second door, sneaks behind the curtain, and replaces the bust with his own fine self. He hears Silvius and Merton incriminate themselves in conversation, and when they both come to the window to admire the stone, which of course was in Silvius's pocket all along, Holmes grabs it. Final score, Holmes and the gramophone 1, Silvius and Merton 0. So, since the gramophone is the real star of the show, I think we should take a closer look at it. Edison's first audio players, later modified by Bell, were actually called graphophones. They appeared in the 1870s and were sold well into the 1880s. They used wax cylinders played by a needle that tracked the grooves on the spinning tube. By the 1890s, graphophones had become gramophones, using flat shellac discs. And since the Mazarin stone is dated in the first years of the new century, it was indeed a flat disc gramophone that was part of the Baker Street furniture. When I began this investigation, my goal was to determine whether a gramophone record of the day could possibly be mistaken for a live performance. Given the primitive recording techniques and the inferior quality of the sound, could Count Silvius be fooled by the substitution? For the record, so to speak, we must mention that according to Anthony Boucher via Les Klinger, no solo violin recording of the barcarolle existed in 1903. Boucher says that Holmes must have used a private recording of his own playing. Okay, whatever. Here you get a look at the technology of the day. These were acoustical recordings, meaning there was no electronics involved. The microphone was nothing more than a backwards megaphone, which concentrated the sound to vibrate a needle by brute force as it cut into the soft spinning master. I did come up with a violin recording of the barcarolle from 1914, but it has a piano accompaniment. Nevertheless, it's certainly worth a listen. Check this out. Well, I've got to admit that it sounded better than I thought it would, but I still wasn't convinced that it could pass for a live performance. Lots of record scratch, which you heard there, not a very powerful sound. Plus, it was recorded a decade after the story took place. So I asked my music historian friend Michael Kravitz if he could come up with a solo violin disc from the turn of the 20th century. Not only did he oblige, but he sent me a recording by this man, a particular favorite of Sherlock Holmes. Not only did he do that, I know that many of you remember that Holmes went to an afternoon recital by Sarasate during the Red-Headed League adventure. A few years ago, I even wrote a poem about it. They dug the bank tunnel for days, while Jabez copied out all the A's. When Holmes spotted the plot, he enjoyed Sarasate, then foiled the foul fiend called John Clay. Thank you very much. But I digress. Here is the Sarasate with some Bach, recorded in 1904. Even though it's an older recording than the Barker roll, it's really not too bad, is it? I was pondering whether it would fool anybody when I realized that I hadn't set up the proper listening conditions. Sylvius had listened to the recording through a closed door. Well, this is our home theater back in Arlington. You can see that it has a rather robust audio system, so I decided to perform an experiment. Since my office adjoins the theater, I went inside and closed the door. I set up a microphone in the office to represent Sylvius and Merton. Then I played the Sarasate recording out in the theater and re-recorded it from the office side of the closed door. Here's the result. Well, I think the result is remarkable. The new listening conditions tend to erase many of the recording shortcomings. Much of the surface noise is gone, and more of the distant violin sound actually makes it sound a bit more realistic for the circumstance. See if you don't agree real quick. Here's a quick comparison. First 10 seconds of the original recording. And here's the re-recorded version through the door. And so I formed my conclusion. Would the gramophone in the next room serve the purpose, fool the criminals, and allow Holmes to retrieve that yellow diamond? Yes, I believe that a scratchy gramophone played through a closed door would do the job. So we cannot fault the story for the gramophone ruse after all. In the few minutes I have left, I think it'd be fun to bring the gramophone down to date a bit. By the mid-1930s, that acoustical recording method given way to electrical recordings. We had microphones, mixing consoles, and starting in the mid-1940s, records were mastered on tape, which was a tremendous, tremendous advancement. But the delivery system hadn't changed all that much. They were still record players and they had amplifiers and speakers, but the records themselves were still pieces of shellac spinning at 78 RPM. That all changed in 1945 thanks to this man, Peter Goldmark, an engineer at CBS Laboratories, and of course, CBS owned Columbia Records. Goldmark was a classical music fan, and he hated the fact that in order to listen to a symphony, you had to change the record 7 or 8 times. So he went to work. He slowed the speed to 33 1/3 RPM, spaced the grooves much more tightly, changed the composition of the discs from shellac to vinyl, and came up with a record that would play for well over 20 minutes per side rather than 4. It was the birth of the long-playing record. Over the decades, the LP withstood challenges from cassette tapes, from open reel tapes, and how many of you, yeah, you do. You remember the 8 tracks, don't you? Yeah, you do. But even with the advent of digital formats, the LP never went away. It's still beloved by audiophiles, and you can still buy those spinning discs along with some beautiful gramophones to play them on. So let's end by doing some then and now listening. Holmes chose the Offenbach barcarolle from the Tales of Hoffmann to serenade the Count. The piece is set in Venice, and as we listen, we're meant to imagine floating down the Grand Canal, past San Marco and under the Rialto Bridge. We'll start with that old acoustical recording, but then we'll move on to something newer. As we do, imagine Holmes sitting in the stalls, wrapped in the most perfect happiness. And so that's the story of the updated gramophone. And that's my time. And I thank you for your attention. It's been a lot of fun. I look forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Our next speaker will be Dan Thomas. He is a trial attorney in the Baltimore metropolitan area, specializing in complex family law litigation. Reintroduced to Sherlock Holmes in the 1980s by the beloved Sherlockian Philip Sherman, he served as Gasogene 20 of the Six Napoleons. In the tradition of Ronald Knox, he plays the grand game and has embarked upon a campaign to instill in followers of the canon the conviction that Sherlock Holmes lived and still lives, tending his bees on the slopes of Sussex Downs, and refuses to believe that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to have been anything but a literary agent for Dr. Watson. Dan is going to speak on Vampires Revisited and a saga of stagnation versus a trip in a Grimm's fairy tale on the Sussex vampire. Dan Thomas.
Hope I don't trip over any of these cards back here. It is wonderful to be back at the Enoch Pratt. Really missed it. And this is as good as the first time I was ever here, because we've been away what felt like 5 or 6 years instead of 1 year. But welcome you all. And I know Phil Sherman is looking down at us right now, and very glad we're doing what we're doing. I've assigned myself one of my favorite objects in the canon, and that is a vampire. Unfortunately, I was unable to provide not only a vampire, but even a picture of a vampire. So I won't be using the electronic devices, and I'll do my best to enlighten you. The vampire is supposedly existed in millennia, according to the historians. Its cultural areas of habitation include, but are not limited to, the Mesopotamians, the Hebrews, the Jews, and the Romans. Despite the occurrence in those civilizations, the entity known as the vampire originates almost exclusively from the 18th century southeastern Europe. In earlier times, all types of horrid acts performed against humanity could qualify the doer as a vampire. The more despicable, the more qualifying, as long as the act was performed by one after his or her death, a condition known as the undead. It was not until the latter part of the 19th century that consumption of a living person's blood became a sine qua non, qualifying the recipient as a vampire. Although it is difficult to make a single definitive description of a vampire, there are several elements common to the Eastern brand. Vampires of this type are usually reported as bloated in appearance and ruddy, purplish, or dark in color. These circumstances or characteristics are often attributed to the recent drinking of blood, which is often seen seeping from the mouth of the one in his or her shared coffin, usually referred to as a box. Aside from the victim's blood being taken by a vampire, little is known as to what causes one to enter into that state. However, various practices have been tried to prevent the cadaver from awakening from the dead as a vampire creature. Examples: placing objects such as sickles near the deceased's grave, placing coins in a corpse's mouth, spreading poppy seeds, mullet, and sand on the ground around the grave, and certainly the most radical, severing the deceased's tendons at both knees. Corpses of vampires were generally described as having a healthier appearance than expected, usually showing little or no signs of decomposition. Parenthetically, this fact undoubtedly disturbs the Roman Catholic hierarchy, as one of the qualifications for sainthood involves the lack of decay of the body of the candidate after death. There are numerous methods of destroying the suspected vampire. Staking through the heart, preferably with an aspen stake, appears to be the most popular, with decapitation, with the head being placed between the feet of the vampire, running a close second choice. Two of Eastern Europe's royalty personified the earlier characteristics of the vampire: the performance of despicable acts, but without human blood consumption, plus neither were of the undead. The first is Vlad III, called Dracula the Impaler. During his primary reign in the Transylvanian province of Romania from 1456 to 1462, he was responsible for the execution of 1/5 of Romania's population by impalement, and those deaths of some 30,000 men, women, children, and even babes in arms were slow in coming only after some hours and even days of impalements. Dracula was followed by the Countess Elizabeth Bartholomei, who was responsible for the death of 610 young girls in Hungary. However, the Countess did not suck the blood of the victims. Instead, she bathed in that blood, believing it to beautify her body. Fast forward to London towards the close of the 19th century. There, Sherlockian Williams Leonard observed, quote, in 1897, Bram Stoker compiled a collection of horrifying notes, clippings, diaries, and other memoranda, and published them under the title of Dracula. They told the fantastic story of Count Dracula, king of the vampires, and his diabolical plot in the summer and early autumn of 1890 to transport himself and a few of his long extinct but undead kingfolk to London, which had never before been cursed by vampires. In Stoker's account published in 1897, Dracula is the quintessential vampire, and Professor Abraham Van Helsing is the iconic vampire hunter, whose band of associates ultimately tracks the box in which the Count rests back to the Romanian site within sight of his castle. And once that box is forced open, Dracula's neck is slashed and his heart impaled, upon which the remains of the Count crumble to dust. And this supposedly ends the Dracula saga. This brings us to the adventure of the Sussex vampire. The tale begins with Sherlock Holmes reading Watson a letter from a firm of lawyers referring their client, Mr. Robert Ferguson, who has an issue with vampires, to Sherlock for assistance. Holmes then consults his good old index under V. He finds vampire along with other V subjects, which in themselves indicate Sherlock's curious methodology of indexing. Examples: Voyage of the Glorious God, Victor Lynch, the forger, and Venomous Lizards. Finding only 2 entries under the subject title, namely Vampirism in Hungary and Vampires in Transylvania, Sherlock throws down the great book and exclaims, "Rubbish! What have we to do with walking corpses who can only be held in grave by stakes driven through their hearts? It's pure lunacy." After Watson calms the situation, Holmes finds a second letter, this one from the client himself. There, facts are cited highlighting events causing Ferguson to believe his young Peruvian wife, second wife, may be inclined towards vampirism. Mrs. Ferguson has been seen on 2 occasions apparently biting the neck and sucking the blood of the couple's infant child. To make matters worse, she has savagely beaten Ferguson's 15-year-old handicapped son of his first marriage, Jack. Even before the duo arrive in Sussex, Sherlock has deduced what is happening, and it has nothing to do with vampires. It turns out the culprit is Jack, who is jealous of his young half-brother. The boy has attempted to murder the infant by shooting poisoned darts at his neck, and his Peruvian stepmother's behavior of sucking her baby's neck to remove the poison is explained. So Sherlock was spot on when, after being calmed by Hop Watson following Holmes' initial outburst, before reading Ferguson's letter, said, "This agency stands flat-footed upon the ground, and no ghosts need apply." However, the world of Sherlock Holmes' simple explanations failed to stand the test of time with other Sherlockians. Kevin Jones believes Sherlock knew the author of Dracula, Bram Stoker, and became involved in the Dracula affair. Further, and even more bizarre, Jones asserts Mary Morstein died of a vampire bite. Howard Knifer believes, given the publicity of the events of Dracula, Holmes knew of the adventure of at least one vampire, namely Dracula himself, and the two reached a peaceful accord treaty. Jones and Knifer both agreed that Mrs. Ferguson was, in fact, a vampire, although Holmes concealed that conclusion. William Leonard, previously mentioned, has called our attention to the fact J. Finley Crisp, an early Sherlockian, had this to say of a relationship between Dracula and the Napoleon of crime, Professor James Moriarty. Moriarty and Dracula were 2 names of the same man. Mr. Holmes had been after him for over 3 months and began to catch up with him in January. Moriarty Dracula knew all this at the time, but Watson didn't get it. If he had, he probably would have told the story he had before Bram Stoker got around to it in 1897. Stoker's account didn't dispose of the count either, for they used a metal dagger instead of a stake of holly, and it didn't kill the vampire. Leonard apparently concurs with Professor Crisp's theory as he concluded his article in the statement, quote, "Well, I say I'm a fundamentalist in these things, but I'm not certain yet whether Professor Moriarty isn't still roaming about waiting for the right man to come along with a stake of holly." Finally, Leonard argues that Dracula's chief protagonist, Professor von Hersling, was Sherlock Holmes. Thomas O'Brien, in a well-reasoned Baker Street Journal article, disagreed with the Dracula Moriarty and consequently Van Hersling Holmes theory. That theory, however, quote, "That theory, however interesting it may be, remains wild and irrational. Should we give serious attention to such things, the journal must remain standing flat-footed on the ground. The world is big enough for us. No ghosts need apply. Stoker's work must be relegated to the work of fiction, where it takes its honored place as an outstanding work of its kind. Apparently, The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire is the only time that the term vampire, appears in the canon. Notwithstanding that absence, Sherlock and vampires abound in numerous other published tales. If you're wondering what became of the real Dracula, the Impaler, he was killed by the Turks and had his head shipped to Istanbul. The rest of him was buried in his homeland. Interestingly enough, when his grave was opened many years later, the only bones found were those of a horse. In closing, I would opt for a more appropriate title for the adventure of the Sussex vampire. And with apologies to Ewan Montague, I would suggest that the saga be retitled The Adventure of the Vampire Who Never Was. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Len Stevens. She is a retired cable TV executive, is an all-round Anglophile, with her love of Sherlock Holmes one major facet of her passion for all things British. Her articles on British arts and culture have been published in The Washington Post, Theatre Week, and Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine. Her first interview among many for Starlog magazine was with actor John Neville, who starred as Holmes in 1965's A Study in Terror. In 2019, Len served as Gasogene, the year-long leadership role for Watson's 10 Box, a local Sherlock Holmes Science Society, and one of the sponsors of today's symposium. And so please welcome Len Stevens, who will speak on Irene Adler's cabinet photograph and other types of Victorian selfies.
It feels like such a big reveal to go. I'm free. Let me find myself here. And there we are. Well, thank you very much and good morning. To start off this morning, I'd like to ask a question and raise your hand. Who here considers A Scandal in Bohemia to be one of their favorite Sherlock Holmes shows? One of them. pretty much unanimous. Well, it's certainly in my top 5. Okay, it's in my top 2. Okay, it's way up there, and I've read it, quite a few times over the years. For those who don't know the story, or for those who may have forgotten the details, Sherlock Holmes is hired by the King of Bohemia to track down and retrieve a photograph of himself with Miss Irene Adler, a noted adventuress. The king, who, by the way, thinks he's all that and a bag of chips of himself. And when I took off my mask, I was thinking, yes, he takes off his disguise. The king believes Miss Adler is possibly going to use the photograph to make life maybe a little difficult for himself, given that he's about to marry someone else. And in the quote that I give from the story above, the king has just told Holmes that the photograph is worth quite a lot to him. Now, for all the times that I've read the story, and this is really, really true, I've stumbled over Holmes's response to the king. In wrapping up the discussion, Holmes asks something that doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense to a modern reader. He says, "Was the photograph a cabinet?" That seems just as weird as saying, "Was the photograph a couch? Or a coffee table? Or an ottoman? Was it a bread box? Was it bigger than a bread box?" Actually, what Holmes was referring to was something that was incredibly common in the late Victorian era. And to best understand it, I'm going to give you a very, very quick tour of the world of Victorian selfies, aka photographs. The first commercial photographic process was invented by Louis Daguerre, hence the name daguerreotype. In England, the first commercial studio taking sitters opened on Regent Street in London in 1841. The images were very fragile and almost always sealed under glass and mounted in a fancy protective case. A sitting only produced one image, and it was small. I'm cutting off the image a little bit here, but I've got the size here, 3 inches by 2 inches. They were very, very tiny. And they were also super expensive. So really only the middle class or the wealthy people could even think about getting a daguerreotype of themselves. Now, despite the expense and the effort, buyers immediately flocked to the studios if they had the money to do so. And they started to photograph their kids and their pets, a trend that has continued in every photographic format from the beginning of photography until today. I do want to point out, if you look at the photo on the left, what's really sweet is you can see the mom's arms are in the photo. She's holding her daughter still because a sitting took approximately 20 seconds. So this mother doesn't want to waste the expense of getting the photo done. She's holding her dear daughter still so that the image will be solid. And that just makes me all the more impressed that this dog image is as clear as it is, because this dog must have stayed very still for those 20 seconds. Now, about 10 years after the daguerreotype, the collodion positive format became popular, in part because it was a whole lot cheaper than daguerreotypes. Still, unfortunately, there was really you're only going to get one image from your sitting, and they were still quite, there's so many playing cards. And it's still awfully small. They're still about 3 inches by about 2 inches. Now you can see in these examples that, like the daguerreotype, these types of photos were mounted in a case because they were also quite fragile. However, because the collodion positive was a lot cheaper to buy than the daguerreotype, the cases themselves are actually usually made out of cardboard. The daguerreotype cases, because they were expensive, the upper middle class and the wealthy were buying them, were often made out of leather or made out of silk. Now, in 1857, in England, the game changer arrived. That was the visiting card. It was patented in France in 1854, where it was known as the carte de visite, because the paper images on the card backing were about the same size as the common visiting card. The two big shifts in this type of photo were that they were really, really cheap to make. You could spend a lot, but there was a whole range. There were photographers that could take people for very cheap, just a couple of pence, to get a sitting and to get a lot of copies. And also you could buy a lot of images from just the one negative. So as you may recognize from this very handsome gentleman here, Prince Albert, once the British royal family got into the act, they got their photos taken and they were printed on visiting cards. Something called cartomania took off. Because visiting cards were so cheap, and because a regular person could not only buy photos of themselves, they could buy photos of their friends, of their family, they could trade them. Women would mail them in letters to far-flung friends and relatives. They could also make collections of photos. Somebody could say, I want to have a collection of visiting cards of various types, and they could place them in specially produced albums that were created just to hold the size of a visiting card. People liked to collect images of famous places. The bottom left photo here is of Rob Roy's house. So you could get landscapes, you could get places, you could get poets like Tennyson, you could get a poet like Byron. And then the central picture there is an image of Moses in the bulrushes. You could collect a whole series of images that came from the Bible. And of course, pet pictures. There's always going to be pet pictures. I'm thinking this could be one of those first cat memes. It's cut off, but it says, bring up the dinner, Betsy. So yes, you could get an entire album, visiting card album of pets, of course. For the first time in history, photography was used for marketing purposes. Ads were printed on visiting cards. They were cheap enough to be able to be given away. Actors would have photographs of themselves taken either as themselves, or holding their skull of York. They would pose in the guise of their most favorite famous character, and then they would give those cards away to their fans. But collecting images of the royal family was also very, very popular. And these are some of the royals on visiting cards that you could collect if you wanted to collect those individuals. And at top of the heap, of course, was the Queen herself. And even though she was a less visible person in person once Prince Albert died, she remained a presence in her subjects' lives throughout the huge number of visiting cards that were circulating throughout the 19th century with her image. Now, starting around 1870, the cabinet card came into vogue. It slowly replaced the visiting card in popularity. Now, it's exactly the same type of photography. It's just bigger. It's 6.5 inches by 4.25 inches. And because it was bigger, it was suitable for framing. And, you guessed it, placing on display in a cabinet. Just like visiting cards, cabinet cards were the format that you could make of yourself, or you could buy collections on a theme. Of course, people continued to use them for all the things people use photographs for: advertising, marketing, personal promotion. Unlike visiting cards, the people didn't tend to put them in albums because the size wasn't really conducive to putting them in albums like the visiting cards. Most of your cabinet cards, the ones that people loved the most, were framed and they were put out for display because they were large enough that you could see them across a room. Of course, Queen Victoria's image remained very popular right through to the end of her reign. As you can see, she had a look. She stuck with it. It was very easy to find images of Queen Victoria in exactly the same widow's weeds. Although there are, towards the very end of her reign, there are a number of commonly found cabinet cards where she is wearing the crown of India, and she's gussied up a little bit more. She's now an empress, so she sort of nodded to that by adding a little bit more to her look. But anyway, back to Sherlock Holmes. In A Scandal in Bohemia, Holmes asks if the photo is a cabinet card. But honestly, knowing Sherlock Holmes, as we all do, it was really more a statement rather than a question. At the time the adventure occurred in 1887, cabinet cards were the predominant collecting size. And even taking into account that in the story, the king and Irene Adler probably had the photo made 5 years earlier, it's still at a time where cabinet cards were the predominant photographic style that you would purchase. Now, if you do a look, if you do any sort of internet search, you will find that there are a number of other photograph sizes that were available at the time. There was the boudoir, which was horizontal and slightly larger than the cabinet card. There was the imperial cabinet card, which was as big as 12 inches, but not by 9 inches. But by far, the cabinet card was the typical size of a photograph that you would get at that time. So in wrapping up, in the future, when you read the story, when you see the word cabinet in your mind, just replace it with a paper photo on a cardboard backing, 6.5 inches by 4.25 inches, and you'll know exactly what it is. And now you know. If you're interested in the fascinating world of 19th century photography, I strongly recommend you visit the Science and Museum blog in the United Kingdom, and also a show that was on WETA at the time that I was preparing this, and was also really, really great, was Lucy Warsley's Royal Photo Album. I did check, it's not currently on Amazon Prime, but I'm hopeful that it will be again. And I also hope that your PBS stations may repeat it, because it had a lot of really great information about the role of photography and the monarchy in Britain. And sometimes when you think of Princess Diana and more modern times, it's not necessarily a happy one, but it's a very, very interesting one. And I leave you with just a question. Thank you.
It struck me that so far no one has chosen a playing card as their favorite object. Someone may be missing a great opportunity here. Our next speaker is going to be Ross Davies, who is a law professor at George Mason University, an editor of the Baker Street Almanac, and founder of the ACD Society. His topic will be, At Last We Have a Clue, One Child's Canonical Cricket Cap.
Masks, spectacles. Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that. Let's see. There we go. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome all Sherlockians. My name is Ross Davies, and I am here to talk about an extraordinary object in the canon, a cricket cap. A cap is not generally considered extraordinary, and a cricket cap is not an extraordinary kind of cap. But this particular cap was extraordinary, because when it was presented to Holmes and Watson, it was described as having two colors, but it actually featured a third undetectable color, as I hope to make clear in the next few minutes. As best I can tell, cricket appears explicitly or implicitly only 3 times in the canon. First, in 1889 Sherlock time, which, by the way, as far as I'm concerned, is Klinger time, there is a mention of a wicket, which is part of the equipment used in cricket. It appears in the Naval Treaty, which was published in 1893. Second, in 1895 Sherlock time, Gilchrist, who is one of the 3 students in The Adventure of the 3 Students, published in 1904, is referred to as a cricket player, just as an illustration of his athleticism, but cricket never comes up again. Finally, in 1901 Sherlock time, another piece of cricket equipment, a cap, yes, here we are, comes in as a clue in The Priory School, which was also published in 1904. As an aside here for cricket aficionados, yes, there is a clever allusion to cricket in the Sign of 4, but it's not enough to merit discussion here. So it is this third mention of cricket in The Priory School that we will be focusing on today. What sort of a clue was it? Well, a boy, Arthur, Lord Saltire, has been kidnapped from the boarding school he is attending. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson are helping the principal of the school, Huxtable, search for young Lord Saltire. The full passage is, there was an agitated knock at the door, and an instant afterwards, Dr. Huxtable was in the room. In his hand, he held a blue cricket cap with a white chevron on the peak. At last we have a clue, he cried. Thank heaven, at last we are on the dear boy's track. It is his cap. Where was it found? In the van of the gypsies who camped on the moor. Oh, the finger of guilt is pointing here. That's not in the text. They left on Tuesday. Today, the police traced them down and examined their caravan. This was found. How do they account for it? It's starting to sound almost like the Musgrave ritual, isn't it? They shuffled and lied, said that they found it on the moor on Tuesday morning. They know where he is, the rascals. Thank goodness they are all safe under lock and key. Either the fear of the law or the Duke's purse, which I presume actually means either the fear of the law or the appeal of the Duke's purse, will certainly get out of them all that they know. So there we are. We have this cap. And we are going to focus on that blue cricket cap with a white chevron on the peak. First, about the blue. There are a lot of blues out there. Wikipedia suggests 91. But we're scientists here, or we all believe in science, and we know, of course, that there is an infinite variety of blues. But in the Sherlockian canon, in the Sherlockian world, there are two blues that are of special significance in the context of schools. First, there is Oxford blue, a dark, lovely blue, right? And then there is Cambridge blue, which is a sort of a barfy green. There's an interesting history behind Cambridge blue, which is entirely respectable, even if this is a rather disreputable blue. But what we have here is a choice between a nice, conventional dark blue and a drab, odd, not blue. The choice is obvious. We are going Oxford today. Next, there is the matter of the cricket cap itself. What is a cricket cap? It's a lot like a baseball cap for our, I think, primarily American audience today. Indeed, many cricket players wear caps that are just like baseball caps. There's a bit more variety among cricket caps. Baggy caps are popular in Australia. Some caps have vivid horizontal stripes. Some are a little bit longer in the front. But basically, a cricket cap looks like a baseball cap. And so here we have a conventional cricket cap in something at least close to Oxford blue. After that, there is the matter of the chevron. A chevron is simply a wide, upside-down V shape that often appears as part of military insignia and on coats of arms. And at last, there is the matter of the peak, because we have a blue cricket cap with a white chevron on the peak. So where is the peak? What is the peak? Well, it turns out that the Oxford English Dictionary, back then and still today, explains or defines the peak as the projecting part of the brim of a man's cap or the like. I do hope that future editions change man's to persons, since I think other people than men wear caps. But in any event, it turns out that what we're talking about and what was being talked about by Huxtable and observed and examined by Holmes and Watson was a cap with a chevron on the brim. Right here. But who puts that kind of thing on the peak of the cap? Or anything for that matter? Well, no one, or nearly no one, which we'll get to in a moment, does so nowadays. But back in Victorian times, school caps in particular sometimes had dates or acronyms or logos on the peak. So that clue in the Priory School probably looked a lot like this one from the Rossall School Cricket Club. Unfortunately, recreating such a cap today would be exceedingly difficult, since the only caps modern manufacturers make with decorations on the peak are the kind that have gold or silver leaf clusters and that are generally the province of captains and admirals and other maritime big shots. The best I could do were, and I think Carla has a couple of spares, were these. This is, well, basically, it is a genuine dark blue 1901 Priory School Cricket Club cricket visor in dark blue. Let's see if we can do this properly right now. It's sort of a bendy, foldy thing. If you do it right and you have more coordination than I do, what you end up with is a chance to, at least for a moment, have something fairly close to the look of Lord Saltire. See? Ready to play. Are we ready? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Now, to get back to the significance of this blue cap with the white chevron on its peak, what about the clue? It was a kind of clue for which Sherlock Holmes stories are, in fact, quite famous. It was a red herring. Neither the cap nor the gypsies appear in the story ever again. It's over. That's all there is. Now, in fact, Sherlock Holmes stories are, for most of the world, the #1 example of red herrings. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up red herring, what you will find is a picture from A Study in Scarlet of another red herring. So Sherlock Holmes is the primary source, or the canon is the primary source of at least literary red herrings. And so there you have it. What is the invisible color of your cap? You are, in fact, wearing a red, white, and blue cap right now. And that is the lesson and the color of the cap. Now, before we go, though, I must add one more thing, which is that the presence of cricket in little dribs and drabs, where it is, in fact, totally irrelevant to the story, over and over, should come as no surprise, because Arthur Conan Doyle, the literary agent, was, in fact, a serious cricket enthusiast. In fact, it's not implausible that he inserted these random bits of cricket into these stories on his own volition after the fact. And much has been said about Conan Doyle and cricket elsewhere, so I will merely point out that this is the Arthur Conan Doyle entry in sort of the most popular modern, what equivalent of Major League Baseball database for cricket players, which is ESPN's Cricinfo database. In other words, Arthur Conan Doyle was, in fact, the equivalent of a major league player in his day. And perhaps most famously, he once bowled out the greatest, which is the equivalent of striking out, the greatest cricketer of all time, W.G. Grace. In other words, Arthur Conan Doyle, the detective fiction writer or agent, did the equivalent in his day of striking out Willie Mays or Frank Robinson or Babe Ruth. How many people in the literary business of any sort could make that kind of claim today? So there you have it. You are welcome for your red herring, and I wish you well and good luck at the grand game.
We will now take a break until 12:30, and we will resume with the festivities. Enjoy yourself.
Run in for 1 second. And everyone online, hello. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be putting up a static slide until 12:30, and then we will resume with the program. So, and again, thank you everybody on Facebook and YouTube, and everyone in person for joining.
In time to resume the Saturday with Sherlock Holmes at the Enoch Pratt Library. Our next speaker is going to be Denny Dobry, who is a retired professional engineer. He designed and constructed his recreation of the 221B Baker Street sitting room at his home in Reading, Pennsylvania. Denny has been Gassagene of the White Rose Irregular of York, Pennsylvania since 1998, and I've heard them say they're not going to let him go until he learns how to do it right. He is a past headlight of the Beacon Society and was invested in the Baker Street Irregulars in 2018 with the investiture of a large, airy sitting room. He has published in numerous publications. Denny resides with his wife of 52 years, Joanne, in their home in Reading, Pennsylvania, and he's going to speak on the incriminating evidence.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. You know what? It's really great to be back at the central branch of the Pratt Library. And I think we should give a round of applause for Carla for making that happen. Yeah, I've been coming. Is this working? Can you hear me? I've been coming to the Pratt off and on for the last 25 years, and this is the first time they've asked me to speak. So unfortunately, you're going to find out why. So. The theme of our forum today is extraordinary items found in the canon. The unveiling of extraordinary items in the canon are often found in the form of evidence. There are evidence that is very incriminating for the perpetrator, and as Ross pointed out earlier, there are red herrings. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to examine three cases. The evidence in these three cases, I'm sure you'll agree with me, there are no red herrings. Case number one. A number of pieces of incriminating evidence are found in this first case. The first two are not extraordinary. However, they are important because they were instrumental in Holmes solving the case. I will examine the last piece of evidence last, which in fact is extraordinary. The string is exceedingly interesting. It has been tarred. The knot is left intact. Anybody? What adventure? Cardboard box. Very good. And here we have the package that the cardboard box was wrapped in and the string that Holmes used as a clue. What did Holmes deduce from the clue, from the string? Right. I observed that the knot was one that was popular with sailors. Case number one, piece of evidence number two. I observed the very instant that I entered the room that you have a portrait group of three ladies upon the mantelpiece, one of whom is yourself, while the others could be no doubt a relationship. What did Holmes deduce from this piece of evidence? Miss Cushing had two sisters, okay, which were instrumental in figuring out this case, obviously. It's two sisters. And now we're going to move on to the most extraordinary piece of evidence. Ta-da! And of course, Holmes deduces from the cardboard box that there were two different people involved. Their ears are different from different people. And that one of Mrs. Cushing's sisters probably is now hard of hearing. Steve Clarkson, co-founder of the Watsonston Box, sponsor of this event today, once said that Jim Browner punished his wife and lover by, are you ready for this? Boxing their ears. If you're not familiar with that term, I don't hear it too much anymore, but when I was in elementary school and I misbehaved, the nun would come down the aisle and box my ears. So that's where the phrase comes from. What is this? Any guesses? It's Holmes digging for clues in the adventure of the cardboard box. Thanks to Jeff Decker, who did this cartoon. Now we're going to move on to the second case. Oh, let me go back. The second case introduces a very extraordinary weapon. These little darts, too, could only be shot in one way. Any guesses? What adventure? I'm sorry? Sign of four, right. And here we have that extraordinary weapon used by Tonga in the sign of four. There's the little guy. All right, and demonstration.
Don't ask for volunteers.
Was that Ross? Okay. Oh no. Aha. If you remember the description, Tonga had a little basket with the beads around it. And this is his blowpipe.
Don't inhale.
You know what? There you go. I didn't kill anybody, did I? All right, we're going to move on to the last piece of evidence, case 3. It's a book he has, a brown leather book with a lock, and his arms in gold on the outside. He had it all in that book. Snapshot photographs, names, details, everything about them. What is this describing and from what adventure? Grooner. What adventure? Yes, Grooner's book, The Illustrious Client. There we go. So we're going to look. This is the Grooner's Lust Diary, which was described by Kitty Winter. And we're going to examine the contents. So I hope there's no weak hearts here or. This is the page from the diary with Kitty Winter's background information. Of course, Grooner would have written in French, but we can interpret this. Name, Catherine Winter. Nickname, Kitty or Hellcat. Nationality, Irish English. Address, the Hell City, London. Telephone, blank. Obviously, she was smart enough not to give Grooner her cell phone number. Marital status, single. Bank, post office savings. Financial worth, very poor, but with many fun funds. Account balance, 400 pounds. That's not so impoverished, but she kept it secret, I guess. Occupation, masseuse. Dimensions, 35, 24, 35. Eyes green, hair red. Age 24 in 1896. That's pretty basic information, okay? But we know that it was something more in this diary. So let's turn the page. There's Miss Kitty Winter, one of the photographs. And of course, the information is in French again. So let's interpret it. Likes, all positions. C, oui. F, C, oui. SN, oui, très. I'll leave it up to your imagination as to what C, F, and CN stands for. But apparently, Kitty Winter liked SN best. So dislikes, none. Apparently, Kitty Winter liked it all. Favorite flower, lavender. Favorite perfume, lavender water. Family, none. Mother and father dead. How many times? Again, I'll leave it to your imagination of how many times what. 115. Wow. Rating 9 to 10. Gripes. Well, that brings us to the end of the diary. And I would like to give credit to the genius of Paul Churchill, who created the diary and who also created the cardboard box. Paul also was a co-founder of the Watch's Tin Box, along with Steve Clarkson. If you would like to see some of this evidence in person, okay, they are all on display at my 221B reconstruction in Reading, Pennsylvania, and visitors are always welcome. Thank you very much. Okay, why isn't that moving? Can't get it to close. Oh, I got lots of stuff here.
Our next speaker is going to be Art Taylor, who is a professor of English at George Mason University and an Edgar Award-winning short story writer whose most recent book is The Boy Detective in the Summer of '74 and Other Tales of Suspense. Art this afternoon is going to speak on cycling with Sherlock, bicycles, and the adventures of the solitary cyclist and the Priory School.
And I'm a Mac person, so I hope I can work this. And I do not seem to be able to. There seems to be no mouse. Sorry about that. I cannot get the mouse to come up.
Mouse has disappeared.
There you go.
There you go.
All right. It literally was not there. So, thank you. Oh no. And he's coming back. There we go. I hit the slide button and it came up with that. Is that the one I'm supposed to do? Slide view. There we go. And that is my presentation. Thank you so much. Apologize for the technical difficulties. I knew as I walked up here that I was going to have that issue. As it was mentioned, I'm a professor at George Mason University. As I tell folks in my classes whenever I teach Sherlock, I am more of an enthusiast than an authority. I feel out of my league a little bit here, redheaded or otherwise, but I appreciate your patience as I move ahead. As it says, cycling with Sherlock. I've picked, and I talked to Carla about this, what seems a fairly ordinary object here. It is not extraordinary at all, but I hope I can show something extraordinary about it. Beginning with this slide here. When I looked on my Kindle and actually searched for bicycle in my complete Sherlock Holmes on the Kindle to make sure I didn't miss anything, these are the stories and the novel that came up with having mentioned a bicycle in some way. What's interesting here, I think, is how many of them are between December 1903 and August of 1904. Two in particular that I'm going to talk about at some length today. There may be a reason for this. I don't have evidence for it, but the first Tour de France was in 1903, just a few months before these stories came out. And it was a great success, of course, much in the news. Now, this is not Sherlock Holmes. This is from The Imitation Game, in which Benedict Cumberbatch plays Alan Turing. But it's good to have Benedict Cumberbatch on an afternoon in any case. The reason I wanted a picture of this, and I have to admit, if you go and do a Google search for Sherlock and bicycles on an image search, it will take you down this rabbit hole. This is also not Sherlock, but you get a story about how Benedict Cumberbatch rescued a cyclist from muggers at one point. You also get, this is a kind of interesting thing, it is an anti-theft GPS tracking device for your bicycle. That's not a commercial, that's just mentioning that it happened. It is called the Sherlock, and you could get that for your bike. So this is not Sherlock, but I wanted a picture of Sherlock on a bike because of the missing 3/4, in which we actually see Sherlock on a bicycle. As he tells Watson, there is, as you may have observed, a bicycle shop next to our inn. Into this I rushed, engaged a bicycle, and was able to get started before the carriage was quite out of sight. I rapidly overtook it, and then keeping at a discreet distance of 100 yards or so, I followed its lights until we were clear of the town. And of course, that does not go well. The person he's pursuing stops and confronts him and eludes him ultimately. I'm not going to talk about the missing 3/4. I want to talk about the two that were published back to back. Solitary Cyclist in December of 1903 and The Priory School in January of 1904. I'm sure that you're familiar with this. And of course, Ross talked about the Priory School to begin with. I'm going to give just a tiny bit of information to set us up. These are pictures, and I'm blocking some of it a little bit. Pictures to accompany. Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. The Solitary Cyclist is Miss Violet Smith. She learns in the beginning of the story that from two men who have come from South Africa that her uncle is dead. She is not in very good economic straits, she and her mother. Mr. Woodley and Mr. Crothers are the two men that inform her. Mr. Woodley is, and I love this phrase, a bully who made odious love to her and asked her to marry him. Mr. Crothers seems kinder. He hires her to teach music to his daughter. But because that is out of town, she has to travel back on the weekends to see her mom, and she does so by riding a bicycle to a train station. That's part of the mystery here, and I'm going to read this in some detail. And now, Mr. Holmes, I come at last to the special thing which has caused me to ask your advice today. You must know that every Saturday forenoon I ride on my bicycle to Farnham Station in order to get the 12:22 to town. The road from Chilton Grange is a lonely one. And at one spot it is particularly so, for it lies for over a mile between Sherlington Heath upon one side and the woods which lie around Sherlington Hall upon the other. You could not find a more lonely tract of road anywhere. It's quite rare to meet so much as a cart or a peasant until you reach the high road near Crooksbury Hill. 2 weeks ago, I was passing this place when I chanced to look over my shoulder, and about 200 yards behind me I saw a man, also on bicycle. He seems to be a middle-aged man with short, dark beard. I looked back before I reached Farnham, but the man was gone, so I thought no more about it. But you can imagine how surprised I was, Mr. Holmes, when on my return on the Monday, I saw the same man on the same stretch of road. My astonishment was increased when the incident occurred again, exactly as before, on the following Saturday and Monday. He always kept his distance and did not molest me in any way, but still, it certainly was very odd. Now, it's not a spoiler to say that there's another use of the term solitary cyclist that does refer later in the story to the man who is following her, and he appears and confronts Holmes and Watson. That's not a spoiler alert. This is also not Sherlock Holmes. This is my son, Dashiell, on his first Halloween, since we're right here just past Halloween. I thought I'd put that picture up there, but there's a reason for that. This is Dash more recently on his bicycle. I don't know if you can read his shirt. It says the next 007. He is not. He is not 007 either. I bring this up because this is the reason why I chose the bicycle. It's for my son. When he learned to ride a bike, as when I learned to ride a bike when I was younger, it seemed the world opened up in an interesting way. All of a sudden, I could go anywhere I wanted. When we take rides out, he's 9 now. I think he was 7 in this picture. When we take rides out, he leads in Fairfax. We go where he wants to go. And there is a sense of freedom and independence and leadership even that seems very important to his development as a person. And I think what we see in microcosm here, in a small way, is also something that gives us a window into what the bicycle meant in the Victorian era. Now, the next picture is actually from the Edwardian era, but let's just pretend. This is an ad for Humber Cycles, and you'll see the vast number of people that are riding. This is actually King Edward in the front, and Humber Cycles and Windsor Castle in the back. Humber Cycles tried to pride itself on this kind of elitist approach in their advertising. King Edward rides a bike, everybody rides a bike, and you should too. This was an ad from 1906, but in fact, the popularity of the bicycle was from much earlier than that. 1870 to 1890, we had millions of bicycles sold. The story, though written in published in 1903, is set in 1895. Now, I'm going to quote here from William Manners, University of York, and a blogger at the Victorian Cyclist. Those men and women in the 1890s were the first generation to experience what we would recognize as modern bicycles. In the late 1880s, penny farthings began to be replaced by safety bicycles with diamond frames, chain-driven rear wheels, and pneumatic tires. For the vast majority of the population who did not own horse-drawn vehicles, purchasing a bicycle meant that for the first time, they owned their own personal means of longer distance transportation. Now, Manners also quotes a contemporary account at the time who said, "Distance is no longer the barrier to the refreshment of country life or contact with kindred spirits." Now, part of this seems recreational, but it was also a difference in terms of jobs. No longer did you have to have a job within walking distance. You could travel further, so there's economic benefits as well, and leisure and health benefits. In fact, Arthur Conan Doyle, and you can find this as a meme on bicycling places. When the spirits are low, when the day appears dark, when work becomes monotonous, when hope hardly seems worth having, just mount a bicycle and go out for a spin down the road without thought on anything but the ride you're taking. Now, if it was important generally for folks at the time, it was particularly important for women, who made up about a third of the market for bicycles at the time. I'm going to quote here as well a female cyclist from 1899 who said, "The bicycle is in truth the women's emancipator. It imparts an open-air freedom and freshness to a life hitherto cribbed, cabined, and confined by convention." This opens up their world in different ways, not only economically, but also in terms of being able to travel on their own. I love an account that says, and I'll find it here, it's the Women's Rescue League of Washington, D.C. that was a little bit less positive about it, said that the bicycling prevented women from having children, promoted immodest attire, and encouraged improper liaisons with the opposite sex. This is from the Bicycle History that I'm quoting some of these quotes. It said that it led young and innocent girls into ruin and disgrace because there were no chaperones with the stamina to keep up with them on rides into the country. There's also an idea of dress reform in the sense that because of the bicycle, women could now accelerate the use of trousers, Turkish pants, which are kind of baggy pants, or bloomers, though interestingly enough, the bicycle industry responded by making the drop frame. I don't know if you see that there, which would allow women to wear dresses and still ride a bike. Come back to Violet Smith. This is a picture from later in the story. And it's important because I don't think that Arthur Conan Doyle is intending this as a cautionary tale of punishment against Miss Violet Smith for having dared to ride her bike down the road by herself. Instead, however, and I speak of this as a crime writer myself, I think it's a great opportunity here to look at what dangers are out there and to increase suspense. If we've got that lonely tract of land and a woman by herself on the road, there's trouble ahead. Now, even though this story is likely not as famous as the Priory School in terms of the attention to bicycles, I do want to mention that story as well in the forensics of tires. Priory School, as Ross already talked about. Conan Doyle ranked the story number 10 on his list of favorites out of 12. Dr. Huxtable of a prep school in northern England is concerned about the disappearance of a student, Lord Saltire, son of the Duke of Holderness. And a German professor, to Heidegger, his bicycle has disappeared too. And it's that attention to bicycles that really drives the investigation in many ways. As you know, famous quote, "A bicycle certainly, but not the bicycle," when they discover some tires. Sherlock says, I am familiar with 42 different impressions left by tires. This, as you perceive, is a Dunlop with a patch upon the outer cover. Heidegger's tires were Palmer's, leaving longitudinal stripes. Aveling, the mathematical master, was sure upon the point. Therefore, it is not Heidegger's track. This track, as you perceive, was made by a rider who was going from the direction of the school. Or toward it? Asked Watson. No, no, my dear Watson. The more deeply sunk impression is, of course, the hind wheel upon which the weight rests. You perceive several places where it's passed across and obliterated the more shallow mark of the front one. It was undoubtedly heading away from the school. There are several maps you can find online that trace these tracks. Now, as Baron Gould has said, much, perhaps too much, has been written about these tire tracks. And if you were to try to follow that down, there's another rabbit hole you can get in. I want to quote two things here, and I hope my time is still good. I am. One is from Arthur Conan Doyle himself. He talks about the remonstrances that he received from his readers. This was not just a question later if he was correct in how well you can trace the direction by looking at the deeply impression of the... He said he tested it himself. And he says, I found that my correspondents were right and I was wrong, for this would be the same whichever way the cycle was moving. On the other hand, the real solution was much simpler, for on an undulating moor, the wheels make a much deeper impression uphill and a more shallow one downhill, so Holmes was justified of his wisdom after all. Now, having had the authority himself talk about this has not quelled some of the controversy. T.S. Blakeney, one of the defenders of the great detective here, wrote, in all cases, Holmes probably had a dozen other small indications to guide him, though he might mention only one factor. And if we follow Les Klinger's annotated, that's part of a rabbit hole as well here, annotated Sherlock, he notes the essay, The More Deeply Sunk Impression by Hiroyami Yuchi, which in turn revisits a 1940 Japanese book, The Techniques of Crime Detection, by, there are two different names I found in my own look here. Sanakita Masayoshi is mentioned in the annotations. I also found Hure Masayoshi in either case. He was a Manchurian police detective, and he came up with all of these reasons how you can trace the direction of bicycles just by looking at the tracks. There's a couple that I want to pay attention to. Stones and other solids embedded in the impressions are pushed toward the direction of motion. We can find skid marks from where they originally rested. When a cart turns a corner at more than 15 kilometers per hour, the wheels will throw out dirt to the outside and leave an impression to the inside of a turn. And then if a motor car or a bicycle runs through a pool of water on its way, the muddy water will scatter toward the direction of motion, and progressive splashes lengthen toward the direction of motion. We assume these are some of the things that Sherlock saw but didn't bother to mention to Watson. And of course, if we look back at the text here, even on that last point about a pool of water, we have the peaty russet moor, we have the muddy stain, the mossy surface, we have the sodden soil, we have a spring trickling across it, a miry path. So I think the evidence is there that Holmes saw much more than we did. Having said all that, I hope I've served to some degree, despite the technical difficulties at the beginning, to show how an ordinary bicycle might be extraordinary in some of these cases. Thank you so much. All right. Trying to close it down.
As long as we were running down rabbit holes, I may as well point out that in 1996, when I was on the Board of Governors of the Mathematical Association of America, the association published a book, Which Way Did the Bicycle Go? So if you really want to run down rabbit holes and you really want to look into the mathematics of tire tracks, I recommend Which Way Did the Bicycle Go? Mathematical Association of America, 1996. Does it get better than that? Our next speaker will be Amy Marshall, who has been a fan of Sherlock Holmes and Watson since childhood. watching Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce on Saturday afternoons after the cartoons were done. She has been a member of Watson's Tin Box since 2018. Amy is a native of Oswego, New York, and escaped the long snowy winters for Maryland in 1999. She is a wife, a mother, a caregiver to many pets, a Star Wars geek, and a yogi. And she will speak on the simple brilliance of the humble pocket notebook.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, this is where the cursor disappears. Oh.
Is this you?
Yeah, that's me. Thank you. So according to Tim Greer in his August 2017 article, What Was in Sherlock Holmes's Everyday Carry, Part 1, Holmes pulls out a pocket notebook and 17 of the adventures that Watson recorded for us. You may ponder, why would any person with such a prodigious power of recall as Sherlock Holmes pencil down any ideas in a pocket notebook? Well, I believe it freed up room in the brain attic. In A Study in Scarlet, Holmes expounds upon this personal theory when he discloses to Watson that he is unconcerned with the workings of the solar system. Holmes says, "You see, I consider that a man's brain originally is like a little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose. A fool takes in all the lumber of every sort that he comes across, so that the knowledge which might be useful to him gets crowded out, or at best is jumbled up with a lot of other things, so that he has difficulty laying his hands upon it. Now, the skillful workman is very careful indeed as to what he takes into his brain attic. He will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work. But of these, he has a large assortment, and all in the most perfect order. It is a mistake to think that that little room has elastic walls and can distend to any extent. Depend upon it, there comes a time when for every addition of knowledge, you forget something that you knew before. It is of the highest importance, therefore, not to have useless facts, elbowing out the useful ones." And I would argue that actually, my dear Holmes, it works both ways. Not only does taking notes down by hand help to free you from the worry of having to remember things, but studies have shown that it helps to boost your ability to retain information. In 2014, Pam Mueller of Princeton University and Daniel Oppenheimer of UCLA published The Pen is Mightier Than the Keyboard: Advantages of Longhand over Laptop Note-Taking, in which they found that whereas taking notes can be beneficial, laptop note-takers' tendency to transcribe lectures verbatim rather than processing information and reframing it in their own words is detrimental to learning. But, sometimes recording another person's actual words is more important than how the listener processes those words. How would your average Victorian era lady or gent have done that in the absence of modern recording devices or laptop computers? They would have written in shorthand, or what they called the wiggling art. John Willis published his system of English language shorthand back in 1603. It appears what really got the ball rolling was the advent of the penny post, and several different forms of shorthand appeared over the centuries. By far, the most popular stenographic script during its heyday in Victorian-era England was Pittman Shorthand. And this is an example of a little snippet of the Lord's Prayer in Pittman Shorthand. Presented to the world in 1837, the symbols of Pittman's stenographic sound hand represent the sounds of words as they are spoken, with strokes at varying angles, connections, and thicknesses, and strategically placed dots or ticks for the vowel sounds. Pittman claimed that when people correspond by shorthand, friendships grow 6 times as fast as under the withering, blighting influence of the moon of longhand. A rival system was Gregg shorthand, devised by Irishman John Robert Gregg. He moved to America in 1893, where his shorthand system spread rapidly as an easier alternative to Pittman's. Yeah, that looks so much easier. Enthusiasts of phonography indulged their passion through popular shorthand magazines and shorthand editions of literature. Titles that were especially popular included the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, Aesop's Fables, and all of Sherlock Holmes's adventures. Publications such as these were useful for practicing translating from shorthand back into written English. And they were also a fun way to feel part of an exclusive fandom. Shorthand was in use long before the Victorian era, and one could argue that it was invented in ancient Egypt. While hieroglyphics were just fine for carving or painting on temples and monuments, hieratic script was the way to go when writing with the reed pen and papyrus. Hieratic was developed during the first dynasty in the 3rd millennium BCE and used until 200 BCE. It started out written from top to bottom, like hieroglyphics, but evolved to be written from right to left. And from hieratic, demotic developed. Demotic is not a form of shorthand. It's instead a natural evolution of the written Egyptian. So here we have with the progression from hieroglyphics to hieratic and then to demotic is shorthand winning out and becoming the standard for a written language. Demotic script was the standard, and it was used until the mid-5th century of this era when it was replaced with the Coptic alphabet. And now we come to my presentation, the part of my presentation I like to call all the lovely, lovely handwriting. So why keep a pocket notebook? Well, all the cool kids keep notebooks. Here are a couple of pages from Sir Isaac Newton's notebooks. He loved notebooks so much that he couldn't have enough of them, and he devised clever ways of using one notebook for multiple topics by writing from the beginning, using one topic, writing from the end of his notebook to meet at the center, so 2 topics working towards each other, and other tricky ways of getting more out of his paper. The page on the left is a page from one of Newton's college notebooks. And on the right here is a page from the notebook he kept while he was sussing out calculus, which he began in 1664 while he was away from Cambridge due to the plague. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin both kept reusable notebooks. Here is an example of Thomas Jefferson's ivory notebooks called polytics. They're like triptychs, where a triptych is an item that is folded into 3s. A polytych is many folded item. Jefferson used his reusable notebook to record temperature, wind direction, weather, bird migrations, many other details of the climate and the seasons, and he would later copy down these observations into the appropriate notebook for permanent keeping. Here's another more ancient example from the Middle Ages of a reusable notebook. This one from France. It's a very, very fancy ivory plaque or tablet that was filled with beeswax. Now, Lewis and Clark, intrepid explorers that they were, documented their entire trek across country in notebooks. These notebooks are looking like they're in pretty good shape for having traveled across country and back by foot. And the explorers had special tin boxes that they used to carry their notebooks to protect them from the elements. Lewis and Clark often worked from rough notes compiled daily. Then soon they would transcribe these into their bound volumes. In most cases, the time between note-taking and transcribing was very brief. And on many occasions, the explorers clearly wrote directly into these beautifully bound volumes. Ludwig van Beethoven never left home without his handy-dandy notebook, as you can see in this lovely artistic work. Whenever inspiration struck, he would scribble down his personal thoughts, passages from literature, poetry, and of course, music. Later in life, as his hearing failed, he always carried with him a conversation book, which his friends and associates used to write down what they wanted to say to the composer. Charles Darwin loved notebooks more than just about anybody ever. He scribbled up an entire pile of notebooks when he was on his adventure on the Beagle. When he brought them back home and processed his notebooks, he just named the new notebooks by the letter of the alphabet. This is a page from Notebook B, and you can see his very first evolutionary tree. Gertrude Bell, the original queen of the desert. She was quite amazing. Her notebooks are available online through the Newcastle University's Gertrude Bell Archive. She was a world traveler, a mountain climber, an archaeologist, an anthropologist, and astute observer of life and politics in the Middle East. She became known as Khatoon, the lady of the court, and for better or for worse, she helped to draw the borders of modern Iraq. This quote is from 1916, when she says, one can't do much more than sit and record. If one is of my sex, devil take it. One can get things recorded in the right way. And that means, I hope, that unconsciously people will judge events as you think they ought to be judged. Marie Curie was one of my personal heroes, a two-time Nobel laureate and a mother to a Nobel laureate. Together with her husband, she was awarded half of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1913 for their study into spontaneous radiation discovered by Becquerel. Becquerel was awarded the other half of the prize. In 1911, she received a second Nobel Prize in chemistry in recognition of her work on radioactivity. Her journals are available for perusal now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. They are kept in lead-lined boxes, and you can only look at them if you first sign a waiver and put on a hazmat suit. This beautiful page is from Frida Kahlo's journal, and she was a 20th century Mexican artist, famous for her self-portraits, which explored the themes of death, humanity, human anatomy, and personal identity. She recorded her dreams and thoughts, as well as poetry, and of course, sketches, this one in full color. And Frida was also honored, she appears in the Pixar film Coco. She is the skeleton, rather eccentric artist that Miguel meets, who has the unibrow. And lastly, This little pocket diary is from Emily Davis. She was an African-American woman living in Philadelphia during the U.S. Civil War. Villanova University has a transcription of Emily's 3 pocket diaries for the years 1863, 64, and 65. She was most likely in her late teens or 20s when she started her pocket diary in 1863. The Penn State Library has these digitally scanned on their website in a slightly larger format, so you can view them better, but it's still nice to have the Villanova transcription because sussing out another person's spelling and handwriting is a little tricky. The first entry of Emily Davis into her 1863 diary was on Thursday, January 1st, 1863, which was Emancipation Day. Today has been a memorable day, and I thank God that I have been spared to see it. The day was religiously observed and all the churches were open. We had quite a jubilee. In the evening, I went to Jones's to a party. Had a very pleasant time. Trivia time. What profession popularized the pocket-sized memo book here in America? Yeah, one would think journalism. Do we have another guess? Bird watching. You're maybe a little closer. It was farming. These are just a few examples of Aaron Draplin's collection. Promotional memo books were distributed to American farmers by seed, tractor, and other agricultural companies. And if you would like to look at this full collection, it's available on the website of the Field Notes Notebook Company. Now, you would say, why would a modern person need to carry around a notebook? When I have this, a smartphone, but this thing also has social media and email and games and the entire internet. If I had $1 for every time I had an idea, and then I went and grabbed my smart device and became instantly distracted and then forgot my idea, I could buy us all lunch. And speaking of lunch, in the summer of 1994, Pixar's John Lasseter, Andrew Stanton, Joe Ranft, and Pete Docter were wrapping up Toy Story when they met for lunch to talk about what would come next. And together they brainstormed sketches for 4 of their upcoming films. And you can see here little characters that would appear in A Bug's Life, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, and Wall-E. This working lunch would result in more than $1 billion for Pixar. What if someone had spilled coffee all over that? So keep it safe. Keep it in a notebook.
Our last speaker will be Andy Solberg. He is a consultant in hospital management, an alumnus of the Johns Hopkins University, and served on the board of the Johns Hopkins Alumni Association. He has been Gassagene of Watson's 10 Box of Ellicott City and is currently Gassagene of the Six Napoleons of Baltimore. One of Andy's accomplishments, which most impresses me, is he manages the essay contest for 7th graders in Howard County, Maryland. And every year he contacts the school board, goes to the 7th grade English teachers, encourages them to read a Sherlock Holmes story. Now my mind is blank. The Speckled Band. And they write an essay on it. The teachers then select the best ones. Andy and his team then select the best of the best, and there's an award contest. And so he's doing his part to ensure we have future Sherlockians. Andy Solberg is going to speak on I Thought My Disguise Was Pretty Good. Andy.
Thank you, Brent, and it certainly is a delight to be back at the Pratt. In A Scandal in Bohemia, Holmes played many parts. The detective, the clergyman, and the drunken-looking groom for starts. This adventure is known for the characters Holmes played and how Holmes failed despite his charade. I'm going to address Holmes's disguises both in this adventure and others where it arises. And we will consider these stories and remember each scene, and then briefly think about what it all means. The first case in which Sherlock Holmes wore a disguise was in The Sign of Four. When looking for the whereabouts of Mordecai Smith's boat, Holmes became an ancient sailor with a red scarf around his throat. With heavy step, his back was bowed, his knees did shake. He used a cudgel, his hair was white, and his asthmatic breathing ached. He had long gray side whiskers and bushy white eyebrows, and his old worn pea jacket showed that he was not a highbrow. The old sailor had come to see Holmes and tell him what he knew of Mordecai Smith's boat, John Small, and all of the jewels. And then in a flash, off came the wig, and there was Sherlock Holmes, teasing his friends who had no clue, Watson and Athelney Jones. You would have met an actor and a rare one, kidded Jones. I thought my disguise was pretty good, said Sherlock Holmes. It seemed that Watson's publication of Holmes's case made him so recognizable that he had to don these alternate faces. In A Scandal in Bohemia, he used two disguises. And in this adventure, of course, Holmes terrorizes Irene Adler on behalf of the Bohemian king because she had a photo he thought could be compromising. First, Holmes dressed as a drunken-looking groom, ill-kempt, side-whiskered, with an inflamed face and disreputable clothes. That was his costume. Spying on Irene Adler, he followed her into a room, and then, ironically, witnessed Irene getting married to her own groom. Holmes then became an amiable clergyman with admirable virtuosity. He wore a broad black hat, baggy trousers, and a general look of benevolent curiosity. Watson said that his very soul changed with every fresh part he assumed, and that the stage lost a fine actor when Holmes' interest in crime bloomed. Again, the goal was to spy on the innocent Irene, not to watch her as she sang an aria from Puccini. He wanted to see to where the poor singer turned when she thought there was a chance that her photo could be burned. Actually, this adventure has two more disguises. The king and Irene both don their own surprises. Once again, Irene's action is the more effective, for the king's was easily seen through, but Irene's was not defective. We next move on to the adventure of the man with the twisted lip. In the beginning of this story, Watson goes into an opium den on a tip that the husband of a friend of his wife was likely stupid there. And so Watson went to fetch him and end his wife's despair. But while in the den, Watson found two friends, the one for whom he came, whom he apprehends, but also a tall, thin man, very wrinkled, bent with age, plucks Watson on his skirt in an effort to engage him. Of course, the old man with the opium pipe dangling between his knees was his friend Sherlock Holmes, who was surprised to see him. Holmes, in disguise, is there, waiting to catch a clue whether Mr. Neville St. Clair had bid the world adieu. Moving on now to the Beryl coronet, Holmes dressed as a common loafer, hoping to upset the plans to sell the stones that were in the stolen crown, and free an innocent man whose future looked quite down. With his collar turned up, his shiny, seedy coat, and looking very crass, and with his worn boots, he was the perfect sample of his class. I think that this should do, said he, glancing into the glass, and off he went to befriend a valet and solve the whole morass. While more of an alias, I suppose I must mention the casework in which Holmes played Mr. Harris and the stockbroker's clerk. Though no mention is made of any such disguise, there may have actually been one, or so we might surmise. Another case in which an alias was used was in The Crooked Man, in which Sherlock Holmes did choose the character of a registration agent. Holmes got what he needed to deduce the truth about Henry Wood and his talented mongoose. But let's move on. In the final problem, when Watson was at Victoria Station waiting for his friend, he was seated with a venerable Italian priest, and Watson was once again astounded by the artiste. For the aged ecclesiastic turned his face Watson's way, and for an instant the wrinkles were smoothed away. The nose drew away from the chin, the lower lip ceased to protrude, the mouth ceased to mumble, the dull eyes regained their fortitude. The drooping figure expanded, but next the whole frame collapsed again, and Holmes had gone back into character as quickly as he had come. Holmes, of course, was trying to evade Moriarty and his men, and so donned a disguise which even fooled his friend. Holmes adopted another role during the hiatus, according to Watson. He traveled the world as the Norwegian named Sigerson. He passed through Persia, looked in on Mecca, and made a short visit to Khartoum, and then the south of France, till he returned to his Baker Street room. During the Hound of the Baskervilles, Watson discovered a cave, which was out on the moor, some stranger's enclave. But when someone called his name and Watson went to the cave's door, he saw the stranger was Sherlock Holmes, dressed like a tourist on the moor. At the beginning of the empty house, Watson visits the site of a recent murder to see if he could shed some light on the crime, like his old friend, who he thought dead for 3 years. Little did he know that Sherlock Holmes would reappear. Watson bumped against an elderly, deformed man who was also tarrying, and he knocked down several books which the man was carrying. When Watson helped to pick them up, he was struck by the old man's looks and thought the old man a poor bibliophile who was a collector of obscure books. And with a snarl of contempt, the old man turned upon his heel, and Watson saw his curved back disappear as though on wheels. But soon, to his astonishment, the stranger paid Watson a visit. His sharp, wizened face, frame of white hair, and his precious books exquisite. "You're surprised to see me, sir," said this bookman in a strange, croaking voice. Watson acknowledged that he was, as if he had a choice. The bookman said that he was really much obliged to Watson for his help, and when he revealed himself as Sherlock Holmes, Watson fainted with a yelp. It was in the Black Peter story, in which Watson added to Holmes' glory by explaining that Holmes could change his personality in 5 places around London with easy informality. And Holmes used a disguise again to learn about Charles Augustus Milverton. Here, Holmes piqued Watson's outrage when Holmes confided that he had gotten engaged. Holmes, as a workman, was a rakish young blade, and he befriended Milverton's maid in order to find out about Milverton's house, and he promised to become the poor girl's spouse. Later in this adventure, when they undertook the task of stealing Milverton's notebook, they donned silk masks. Now, one wouldn't think that the masks would make it very hard to recognize them both, but they may have fooled Lestrade. In The Dying Detective, Holmes's disguise fooled with Watson, Mrs. Hudson, and Culverton Smith. Holmes pretended to have a deadly type of pox, which he allegedly caught from Smith's mysterious little box. The whole idea was to lure Culverton Smith, and so Holmes played a sick man with enthusiasm and pith. with Vaseline upon his forehead, belladonna on his eyes, a little rouge and beeswax, he looked like his demise. In the very next adventure, about Lady Carfax, an unshaven French ouvrier saved Watson from being whacked. In a blue blouse, starting from a cabaret, holding a club, the stranger stopped Philip Green from giving Watson a drubbing. Later, that stranger chided Watson and admitted that there was not a possible blunder that Watson had omitted. To give the alarm everywhere and then discover not, the stranger was, of course, Sherlock Holmes, who was feeling rather taut. Then, of course, there was the last bow, in which Holmes became an Irish-American, working up to his pitch to the German spy von Bork in order to supply the Germans with inaccurate information and then arrest the spy. Holmes played the role of Altamont as part of this scam, a tall, gaunt man of 60, goateed like Uncle Sam. Holmes had spent 2 years as Altamont in the US of A, working his way into von Bork's dossier. The next adventure in which Sherlock Holmes wore a disguise was in the Mazarin Stone. However, look carefully. You might miss it if you just scan. It simply mentions that Holmes played the parts of a woman and a workman. The last disguise can be found in the last case, when Holmes and Watson visit Shoscombe Old Place. No one could know who they really were when they traveled under the disguise of 2 fishermen. Well, now that I've finished this little review, I'd like to move on to something anew. But don't worry, it is related, alas. It addresses how these disguises are related to class. In her social study of Holmes, Rosemary Jan advises that in all of these stories, all of these guises that Holmes uses are pretending to be cast as someone of a lower class. Now, what she says is that upper class slumming is always less socially threatening and unbecoming, but rather that than when a lower class person attempts to rise and use an upper class alias as a disguise. You see, she states the appeal of the detective story is not that it's clever or that it's gory, but rather that the detective discovers disorder and by the end restores social order. And so Holmes' ability to successfully master disguises helps him abort social disaster. And it turns out that the disguises he chose also define the caste system we know. And so we come back to our Bohemian scandal, in which Holmes becomes, well, a thief and a vandal, in order to make some progress on his case and restore social order and social grace. So Holmes donned his old clothes to become a low-class groom, and then he donned a simple clergyman's costume. Because these were simplistic people of rank, and we feel comfortable and give Holmes our thanks. Even though Holmes is doing the work of a colossal royal bohemian jerk. When you think of it, our own really consolation should have been that Holmes failed miserably in outsmarting Irene. Thank you.
The time has come for the Inquisition. We will be passing out the set of 14 questions. You'll have about 5 minutes to work on them. Does everybody have a quiz that wants a quiz? Wave your hand if you don't have one. Oh, we're missing one right over here, Carla. I'll briefly go over the questions for you. The questions are not on the sheets. Thank you. Now I understand why everyone was staring so intently at me. Right, I'll catch on lately. Question 1. In the adventure of the Priory School, where was Lord Saltire's cricket cap found? In the adventure of the Priory School, where was Lord Saltire's cricket cap found? That's question 1. Question 2, who wrote, as Holmes called it, the Hoffman Barcarolle? And I'll give you a hint, it was not Hoffman. Question 3, what event, the first of its kind, made big headlines in 1903, just a few months before the publication of The Adventures of the Solitary Cyclist and the Priory School? Question 4, name the Hungarian countess who bathed in the blood of young girls to beautify her body. Question 5, true or false? No one else was ever allowed to touch Ludwig van Beethoven's personal notebook. True or false? Question 6, who was the first British royal to be photographed? Question 7, which part of a cricket cap is called the peak? Question 8, according to Arthur Conan Doyle, when the spirits are low, when the day appears dark, when work becomes monotonous, when hope hardly seems worth having, you should do what? Question 9, what kind of special preparation must be taken before viewing Marie Curie's laboratory journals? Question 10, who suggested that Jim Browner's punishment for his wife and lover was to box their ears? Question 7, what ancient culture invented a form of shorthand to complement its complicated formal writing system? Question 12, why did Victoria and Albert like releasing pictures of themselves and their children to the public? Question 13, there's several possible answers to this one. Identify 2 plot points in the Mazarin Stone that are borrowed from the empty house. And question 14, we cannot be sure about all the school colors of the Priory School, but we can be pretty sure we know one of them. What color is that? And so those are the 14 questions. I'm sorry? I will repeat them very briefly. Question 1, in the adventure of the Priory School, where was Lord Saltire's cricket cap found? Question 2, who wrote, as Holmes called it, the Hoffman Barcarolle? Question 3, what event, the first of its kind, made big headlines in 1903, just a few months before the publication of The Adventures of the Solitary Cyclist and the Priory School? Question 4. Name the Hungarian countess who bathed in the blood of young girls to beautify her body. Question 5. True or false? No one else was ever allowed to touch Ludwig van Beethoven's personal notebook. Question 6. Who was the first British royal to be photographed? Question 7. What part of a cricket cap is called the peak? Question 8. According to Arthur Conan Doyle, when the spirits are low, when the day appears dark, when work becomes monotonous, when hope hardly seems worth having, you should do what? Question 9. What kind of special preparations must be taken before viewing Marie Curie's laboratory journals? Question 10. Who suggested that Jim Browner's punishment for his wife and lover was to box their ears? Question 11. What ancient culture invented a form of shorthand to complement its complicated formal writing system? Question 12. Why did Victoria and Albert like releasing pictures of themselves and their children to the public? Question 13. Identify 2 plot points in the Mazarin Stone that are borrowed from the empty house. Question 14. We cannot be sure about all the school colors of the Priory School, but we can be pretty sure we know one of them. What color is that? I'll repeat a question by call, by number, if we need one specifically to be repeated. Otherwise, we'll go to the answers. You're grading this is on the honor system, so grade yourself. The Lord Saltire's cricket cap was found in the van of the gypsies who camped on the moor. The author of the Hoffman-Barker rule was James Offenbach. The sports event of 1903 was the Tour de France. The Hungarian countess was Elizabeth Bathory. It is false that no one could touch Ludwig van Beethoven's personal notebook. The first British royal to be photographed was Prince Albert, who was a fashion forward on all cutting-edge science and technology. The bill that protects from the front of the cap to shade the eyes of the wearer is called the peak of a cricket cap. What did Doyle want you to do? Ride your bike. The special preparation to see Marie Curie's laboratory journals is donning a suit to protect yourself from the radiation. Steve Clarkson, co-founder of Watson's 10 Box, suggested that Jim Browner's punishment should be to box his ears. What ancient culture invented a form of shorthand? That was Egypt. Victoria and Albert liked releasing pictures because it was a PR move, showing themselves as normal people. Very average looking in normal clothes made them seem unthreatening, in contrast to other monarchies on the continent that were being destroyed in revolutions. Also, their sober lifestyle set them apart from the lusty and gluttonous Georgians. Plot points borrowed from the empty house for the Mazarin Stone include a wax bust in the window, an air gun, and a big game hunter. And then finally, what color do we suspect was among those of the Priory School is blue. All right, you've had the questions, you've had the answers, add them up and see how many you got right. All right, did anyone?
We have 3 prizes, and with the top 3 folks will get a prize.
Did anyone get 14 questions right? What about 13? 12? 11? Carla, I think we may have done it at 11.
All right, 3 11s. I will award each of you a prize. It's my choice, but you have to guess a number between 1 and 20. The closest will get 1, 2, and 3. So, number between 1 and 20.
11, 15, 17.
Okay, the number was 1.
I don't think 1 and 20. I think
We have had the presentations, we have had the interrogation, and now we're closed with a few words from Carla Coop, this year's coordinator. Carla is past Gassagene of Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City and has been invested in the adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes and the Baker Street Irregular. Carla, thank you very much.
So this is very fast and everybody's hungry. First, I'd like to thank the staff of the Pratt Library, especially John Cardellino, Kelly Shimabukuro, yes, Sophia Noali, and Tracy Diamond for all their help in hosting this year's A Saturday with Sherlock Holmes. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our sponsoring scions, the Six Napoleons of Baltimore, the Sherlockians of Baltimore, and Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City. And of course, our speakers. Without them, the entire event would have been a colossal bore. So thanks very much, and praise to all of you, firstly, for saying yes when I asked you to participate, and second, for showing up and providing such interesting and entertaining presentations. Thank you, Brent, for sharing your skill as an MC. Additional thanks go to Kathy Herrig of Mystery Loves Company in Oxford, Maryland, for providing the books for today's prizes and the scintillation of scions for the pillow. And thank you all for showing up and giving our speakers friendly faces to see in the audience. I hope we've made Beth Austin proud. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Carla, and thank you all so much for joining us today again. I'd like to thank Hasso for providing us accessibility today. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody virtually, for joining us. And again, thank you all for joining us in person. It's so lovely to see faces and hear applause and laughter in the library again. Just a few quick plugs for some upcoming events that we have on our events calendar. This Tuesday, November 9th, award-winning documentary filmmaker Dawn Porter will be here in the Wheeler Auditorium at 7:00 p.m. We're really excited to engage in a conversation about Dawn's work and life. And then upcoming the week after that, on Tuesday, November 16th at 7 p.m., we will have Celeste Headley, author, in-house for a conversation about her new work, Speaking of Race, Why Everybody Needs to Talk About Racism and How to Do It. That will be on November 16th at 7:00 p.m. There are flyers for these events right when you head out. Also, thank you to Benjamin behind the scenes for helping with our case of the disappearing mouse. And yeah. And thank you all again so much for joining us today. And please, please visit prattlibrary.org for upcoming events and resources that we're so proud to be providing to the community. Thanks.